It's like trying to make chocolate chip cookies with 50 people in the kitchen. It's not going to go much faster. I'd say that's the most essential quality. If they don't use agile, then run.
I mean, it's like finding the number one pizza spot in New York. All of them say they're the number one spot, right? All right, welcome to the Ksense podcast. Today I'm joined by Kelson Erwin, CEO at Ksense Technology Group. And we're going to be talking about the framework, the decision-making framework for how to choose a software development agency. So thanks so much for joining me, Kelson.
Yeah, I'm excited for this one.
Awesome. So let's just jump right in. This is obviously a question that a lot of people have. It's becoming increasingly popular, I've noticed, for people to not have big development teams in-house. Most companies, once you reach a certain size, you have at least a few developers, right? But it's becoming increasingly common to outsource project work where you don't need to grow your team and maintain a bigger team. So let's talk about how people can make good decisions when they're choosing an agency to outsource some of these projects to. So the first is just, how is this important? How is choosing the right team going to impact a project? Why is it so important to find a good team?
Yeah, so once you decide that you need custom software for your business, and you're shopping around, the reason why it's so critical to your business success is because generally that agency is going to be a long-term partnership. The application or product that you're building is going to be a high or large investment. And also it impacts a lot of things like the quality of the software and also the strategy, because a really good agency is going to be able to provide better strategy, whether it comes to the technical solutions that they decide on. For example, using a tech stack that they can move faster with, or just understanding how to solve your business in better ways. So, generally speaking, when most companies are doing a project or they're hiring someone new, it's not always such a large investment or long-term partnership. When it comes to selecting a software development agency, it tends to be just a much larger decision.
That makes sense. So why do people struggle with this? What are some of the reasons why people just are making bad choices sometimes? Is it their fault? Is it something that can be avoided? Why do people struggle with this?
I think it's really hard to decide on who you're going to hire because there are just so many different options, and there's often a big technical expertise gap where the business owner that knows that they need custom software doesn't know a whole lot about how custom software is built.
Yeah.
Or the process that goes into it. Think of it like somebody who knows nothing about cars trying to evaluate what is a good mechanic. Like it's very difficult. And then also I think that a lot of business owners don't fully understand what business objectives or goals they're trying to solve with the software, which makes it even more difficult because they don't know what type of specialist to recruit, right? Like, do we need a mobile app versus do we need a web application? What about a desktop application? Or is this something that we, maybe shouldn't even be doing with custom software at all? And not truly understanding the underlying objectives can make it a really difficult decision when you're evaluating. And of course, everybody's going to put their best face on and say that they can solve all the problems in the world. But as soon as you get into the actual development, a lot of times people, find that that's not the case.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, it's like finding the number one pizza spot in New York. All of them say they're the number one spot, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So I'd love to dig into that more. You mentioned like really knowing what you need, understanding your business needs. How do people do that? How do you get started if you don't already know Or how do you find out, right? Because I think that's a piece of this is a lot of times people think they know what they need. They start getting into a project and all their needs start to kind of be uncovered. What's a good way to go about this? How can they clearly define their needs?
Now that we've established that developing custom software is a big investment and it carries some significant financial risks and other risks too. I think the first place to start is to decide whether or not you actually need a custom web development. And you probably won't hear a lot of people, like if you go meet with agencies, they're probably not going to start there because they make their money based on having convincing you to build these custom web apps. But the first question is like, do you actually need it? That needs to be figured out. Can you do it with an existing off-the-shelf software, or can you make some modifications to something that already exists and use that instead? That would be where I would start. And then after you are sure that you need custom software, then I would start with analyzing what are the goals, what business impact is this software going to have, and look at it from what are our pain points, what goals, and how can we measure these? And you can do that by looking at all your current processes and evaluating the bottlenecks and saying, okay, what are we expecting the software to fix here? From there, the next thing to do would be to prioritize those based on what features of the software will fix the most bottlenecks, will solve the most pain. And then after that, what I would suggest doing is, after you've established what business outcomes and what features are correlated, then I would make a list of those top priority ones and group them into a minimal viable product so that the company that you're going to work with can build something small first before building everything on your wish list.
Makes sense. So we define those needs by asking good questions, right? And by drilling down into where the ROI is going to come from, is what I'm hearing. So really identifying the business need is what's the value that it's going to give us, right? And kind of weighing that against your current process or your current costs. So is that where you go next as far as, planning a project or a framework for deciding who to work with? Is that where you would then move into the budget side of the conversation?
It depends. Like there's a lot of work. If you're asking, is there more work that a company can do before getting into budget? I think there is more work. Like I think that there is a lot of things that an organization can do to truly understand how the software is going to help them before they talk to anybody else. Mm-hmm. And if they have a really good understanding of exactly what their needs are, how they're going to measure the result of the software that's going to be implemented, and have some idea, maybe they're not designing the features, we'll help with that, or whatever agency should help with that. But to kind of have an idea, like the reason we want this in the first place is because we have these goals and we know that there will be a proportional impact once we develop the software.
Right. So it's like either, hey, this is a pain point for us and it's costing us this much money, or, it's slowing us down, or it's, hey, this new feature would be value added because it would allow us to do this new thing or, expand our capabilities. When you're going through that process and you're defining your needs, how do you distinguish between the need to haves and the nice to haves?
Yeah, I mean, there's a pretty easy way to do it. You say, if this specific feature was missing from the software, would the entire project fail? Would it be useless to us? Or would it just be inconvenient? Mm-hmm. And the must-haves are the ones that make the entire project fail.
So once a business understands their needs, they know what their pain points are or what the new features and functionality is that they're working on. What sort of questions should they be asking themselves before they get started on searching for an agency?
Yeah, we can kind of break this one down into three main categories. We have the project, which is what's the problem, what's our budget, and when do we need it? And that'll tell us a lot of information about what is actually going to be built and some constraints around that. The second one is the people. Who's going to lead the development efforts? Who's going to be the point of contact for the agency? Who knows most about the certain pain points and bottlenecks that this software is supposed to solve? And then who's going to use the software? Who are all the stakeholders? Who's actually going to log in? And then who's going to manage it long term? And then the third category is like the future. What are the things that might come down the road that might need to be changed? How big could the software get? Is it going to grow into hundreds of thousands of users? Is it going to turn into the backbone of your entire business where you can't even run your business without it? And who's going to take care of it and maintain it and support it through in the future when things break or technologies evolve? Like those are, I think, the three categories that need to be thought about before you even start the search for an agency.
Clear picture there of understanding needs and understanding the project itself. So let's jump into the budget side. How should companies approach budgeting for these kinds of projects? What should their mindset be? What factors sort of influence the budget or the price of the project? What can you tell me about that?
Yeah, I mean, this one, we made another video, I think, on this question specifically. So I'll try not to dive in too deep, but it is one of the most challenging aspects to software development is the budget. And the way that I try to teach people to think about it is you want a budget for the product, not the project. And to kind of elaborate on what that means, we want to think about the product as a continuous investment. Think of it like you hire an employee for continual work over time, and you evaluate their work over time, and you pay them weekly or bi-weekly or monthly, and there's no like defined endpoint. And this is what, when I talked about the product, that's kind of what I'm saying. We're gonna establish a budget based on the idea that this is going to be a continuous investment. It's going to be something that's going to require continual work, continual maintenance. Your users' needs are going to change. Your business is going to change, and there's not really going to be a defined endpoint. And where a project, a lot of people go into software thinking that it's just a project. We're going to have a due date, a timeline. The whole project's going to cost this much. The developers or agency is going to deliver one product. They think of it like a lot more like building a home, when it's really not at all like building a home at all. It's more similar to writing a book, where you start writing and you iterate and you iterate and you iterate and you just keep iterating, and then once you ship your first book, then next thing you know, you're writing a second one because everybody loved the first one so much. So you want to budget for the product, not the project. There's a couple other questions in there. I think you asked like what factors, is that right,
Yeah.
David?
Yeah. What factors kind of influence how much it will cost?
The biggest factor is the complexity of the application. If all you need is like one form, and somebody's going to go in, they're going to submit that form, it's going to send an email, it's going to be a very small project. But if you need a very complicated, where there's tons of business logic, there's tons of custom validation, the style needs to be really modern, very beautiful, very interactive. As the complexity increases, so does the cost of the project. And I think that's probably the biggest aspect. And then the second biggest aspect is going to be who's actually building it. And this point is a little bit counterintuitive, and feel free to look this up. But the mid-level and junior engineers, even though they cost more per hour, end up resulting in lower costs overall, even though the upfront cost may be higher. And we also see that same goes for hiring onshore versus hiring nearshore or offshore. We also see that you save more money by paying more money upfront, So the team is a big part of it. If you can find experts who have experience doing these types of applications, they'll be able to do it really quickly and deliver you very high quality results that won't need a whole lot of won't need as much maintenance. There won't be as many bugs. Your users will be happier with the software. And then the last thing is just like how fast do you need the software? If you need it really, really fast, then it's going to cost more money. And the reason isn't just because we charge more money when somebody says, I need this next month. It's because the more people that are working on it and the more things that need to run in parallel, the more inefficiencies are kind of baked into that process. It's like trying to make chocolate chip cookies with 50 people in the kitchen. It's not going to go much faster.
Yeah, that's so true. It's like thinking that you can speed up a recipe by having one person do each step all at once, and it just doesn't work that way. There's a reason for an order of operations, and you don't necessarily get to certain decisions until you've already made certain decisions, right? And I'll put a card up here in the video for people to look at the conversation you just referenced, because I think that's a really interesting conversation about counterintuitively, if you spend more per hour, you'll spend less on the project. And that's been shown time and time again. And of course, there are exceptions to that. But in general, on average, you get a higher quality of developer and a more complete team, right? Somebody who knows how to actually deploy the application, not just write the application. Definitely check that out if you guys are interested in understanding a little bit more about the financial aspect of how these projects go, because it really does pay. We're not just saying that. It really does pay to choose a good agency for these kinds of projects and make sure that it's somebody who you can trust, right? And who does high quality work.
It is interesting as well because it's counterintuitive when for software. But if you think about like any other business asset, generally people know that you spend more money up front and your tractors run longer, they need less maintenance, your machinery and if you do manufacturing, you never choose the cheapest options with those. You know that there's problems when you do. And so it's just interesting how it's like everybody knows that anytime they buy any business asset, like any physical, tangible asset, but they just think that software is somehow different. Like it technically is it's not physical, but like it's very similar. It's engineering. The product is designed by people. And so I just think that's kind of funny.
Yeah.
Because it seems like it's only software where that's counterintuitive.
Yeah. I mean, it's, I think of it sort of like an electrician. Like, you can hop on Reddit and see some really funny, electrical jobs that somebody hired their neighbor or something, or, oh, my uncle knows how to do this, he'll take care of it for me. And you end up with these just like messy, unsafe solutions, right? It's not really doing what they needed, or it is, but it's like, it's sort of a matter of time until the whole thing fails and it's not really a safe setup. And that's really what you see when you go out and hire a software developer who is just, maybe it's a one-person team, maybe they're not very experienced. And for a number of reasons, you just end up with a project result that you don't want. And often you end up hiring the high quality electrician anyway, right? You just have to invest more.
And they have to fix up all the mess that already exists, right? So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, go in and clear it out and do it right. So are there any sort of like hidden costs or costs that people don't think about when they're having those budget conversations and setting up a plan?
Just about all the hidden costs are costs that go into running, maintaining, and supporting the software. So, I'm sure that sometimes you get on your computer and your operating system, Microsoft, Windows or Mac, it says, oh, we need to install some updates. And sometimes you'll see, oh, we need to install some security updates. There's changes to code that often take place in order to keep things secure. And it's kind of a cat and mouse situation. A lot of times it just It's just making sure that everything's up to date, which is the maintenance side of things. But there's also, when we're building software, a lot of times that software isn't isolated. It oftentimes will talk to different things, different systems, and those systems also are changing. The new features are created, things get deprecated and no longer work. And so there is a cost to making the changes necessary to keep everything working. And then there's just the cost of keeping the app running, which is going to be like, you want a domain name, www dot, where you're going to put the app. You need somewhere to host it. Those are also costs that a lot of people don't think of. Generally these hidden costs are 10% or less of the total cost of the application. But I do like to be upfront about them because it definitely isn't a situation where you get your app and you don't have to pay any more money ever again.
Yeah, and exactly. I mean, we're calling it a hidden cost, but to go back to this whole thing about how do you choose a good agency, they should be setting those expectations, just like you're talking about, where you don't think that you're going to pay once to have this application and that it's just going to run forever and be on the internet without any costs. Yeah, like you said, it's a fraction of the actual development cost, but it is something that if you're hiring an agency to develop an application for you, they should go over that with you. They should set some sort of expectation about, on an ongoing basis, what you're just going to be paying to just have the thing exist, just have it up and running. Now, you said something a little bit ago that I'd like to dig into a little bit because I think is really important for people to understand. You were talking about the project timeline a little bit as it relates to budgeting, and talking about how you should think about the cost of the product, not the cost of the project, because as a product, as we sort of just finished talking about, there's going to be some sort of ongoing cost. There's going to be not just the hosting and the domain name, but also security update comes out and you need a developer to go in there and make sure your app is up to date and all that stuff. So it can be unexpected, even if it's not hidden from the client, right? What I think confuses people is the thought of, well, my project is never really done, right? There's not really a timeline. And that can be scary because they're thinking, oh, well, if I hire a company to create an app, they're just going to always be a huge expense for me for years and years and years to come. So can you add a little bit of clarity there as far as how people should think about those timelines? We just kind of highlighted the separation between those timelines. Like once you launch the app, you've got a different kind of cost timeline. But can you just sort of explain how companies can set realistic timelines for their project as well as the product, that distinction that you made there?
Yeah, so there's kind of a software life cycle, and without really getting into the weeds, basically you can think of it, there's like every single software product has different stages of its life before it eventually dies. Like when we say it goes on forever, it doesn't. Eventually, almost every single piece of software will die. Think about all the software tools that we used 10 years ago. Almost all of them are gone, right? So instead of comparing like when is it going to be done, the question should be, when is it going to get to the next stage of its life cycle? And the first stage of that is the minimum viable product. It is the stage of the application that achieves the smallest set of features that are required to achieve some sort of business goal. If we can have the software do just a couple of things to achieve the biggest pain points, and we can group those together and use that by itself, that's our minimal viable product. And that's the first step. And then after that's done, then every step in the process after that is just an iteration on top of it. And each iteration should be evaluated by itself based on the business outcomes. We have our set of 5 features. We're considering adding a 6th. And this is the time to ask, what is the ROI? What is the business impact? Is the business impact worth what number 6 is going to cost? Is it? And then from there, we can say, all right, how much is it going to cost? And also, how long is it going to take for us to go from 0 to MVP? And how long is it going to take for us to go from the MVP to, we could say version 6 or whatever, the sixth iteration, the sixth feature, I should say. And maybe it would be more clear if we talk about these in versions. Like the first version is the minimal viable product, how long to get to that, and then how long to get from version 1 to version 2. And then what we like to do and what we recommend other people do is talk about kind of best case and worst case scenarios and say, all right, what is the best case scenario for budget, or our best case is what's our realistic guess, and what is our worst case scenario guess, and then kind of have a window, and that'll give us an idea on how long and how much these things are going to cost, because it can be really difficult to know exactly how long things are going to take, especially when we're building software, because a lot of times we're doing things that have never been done. We're creating novel systems that are unique to very specific business problems. And so it can be challenging sometimes to give incredibly specific timelines or budgets. Usually we're able to get each version, within 10 to 20 hours though, which is really nice. So we're not looking at best case scenario is 2 weeks of development and worst case is 2 years.
Right. Yeah, it's going to be some manageable fluctuation from the estimate. And that's really, speaking of the process of deciding who to work with, that should be some of that process, right? It's just asking the agency that you're considering hiring to work on your project to give you a good estimate. Usually in that early stage, like you just said, there's going to be some variability there because you don't know exactly how long it's going to take until you actually get in there and you're creating the new custom tools and you know exactly where it needs to connect and so forth. What they can do is provide a good estimate that, maybe there will be some variance there. Maybe it'll be a little higher, a little lower, but that should be part of the process, right? That the agency is providing you some expectations, okay, the first sprint of this project is to work on this, and here's the estimate for what that's going to take.
It might take more or less time depending on how complex your needs are, but you can do discovery and really try to flesh out what are the smallest subset of features that we can add that will have the most positive business outcomes. And from there, we can get an idea of, how much money is that going to save you as a business owner? Or how much money is that going to save your department? Like, what are the outcomes we're looking for here? Maybe they aren't monetary. But then we can go one step further and we can say, all right, now we have these features fleshed out, which we didn't even know that these are the features that you needed when we first talked to you. How long are each one of these going to take? And we can get a best case and worst case scenario for your first version out the door. What's difficult is to estimate how much the entirety of the project is going to cost, because as you'll see, whether you decide to go with somebody who offers fixed rate or they do more of a flexible agile approach like we do, you'll see that regardless, as soon as you start talking to them, the entirety of the scope is going to completely change.
As just the nature of the beast, right? No matter what, it's going to have to change. But you want to find people who, at the earliest stage and all the way through the project, you can see that they're understanding you, right? That they get what you're asking for, what your needs are, what your concerns are. As long as there's that clear understanding back and forth where you're like, okay, they understand my business. They understand what I need. Right. So that you're not talking about totally different ideas of what the app is going to look like and what it's going to do for you. As long as that's the case, you should be able to get some clarity around what the timeline is going to look like and how much it's going to cost. Let's talk about how we sort of evaluate the agencies now that we're kind of shopping around. We know what our project is. We know kind of what our general idea around budget and timeline. What are some of the sort of key qualities that you want to see in an agency before you hire them?
Arguably the largest thing to look for that will determine whether your app goes well or it completely fails is the methodology that the agency decides to take. If they treat the project under the guise of a what we call waterfall methodology, which is essentially you do all of the planning up front for the entire application, which generally involves doing all of the mock-ups, wireframes, prototypes, all the documentation, and you build it like you would a home. You have your blueprints and you have exactly what's going to be built, and you do all that up front. Agencies that follow that methodology, their applications almost always fail. And the reason why is because web apps are not built like homes. They're built a lot more like if you hired somebody to write a novel for you. There has to be communication, opinions change, and in business, not only do opinions change, but the business landscape in which you operate change. You may have new regulatory requirements that you need to meet that come out of new legislation. You might have new products coming out, and so the it needs to be more flexible than the rigid structure that waterfall offers in order for the project to be successful. And even in the best well-intentioned people that do waterfall, what happens every single time is they get partway into the project and the scope starts to change, or they deliver the entire project at the very end, which is worst case scenario. And the users get it in their hands and they're like, yeah, this meets the spec perfectly, but it's not at all what our users want. And so how do you find what the users want? How do you evolve and have your app change with the business landscape? What you do is you build the software in small pieces where every piece is associated to a business outcome. And every time that feature is complete, you release it to the users and you say, what do you guys think? And if they hate it, then you change it and you continue to iterate. And that's the agile approach to software development. I'd say that's the most essential quality. If they don't use agile, then run, because they may tell you, yeah, we're going to build your app, we're going to write up all the documentation, and it's going to cost $100,000. I've never seen a project where the budget doesn't increase or the timeline doesn't increase dramatically. And you're left wondering for months and months how the software project's going until you get something in your hands. And when you do get something in your hands, it's not going to be at all what you expected.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's like, trying to plan out the whole thing and then build it in one shot rather than what you were describing of, yes, we have a plan for the whole thing. We know what the whole thing should accomplish as a whole, but then, narrowing it down to the key features, right? Like what are the pain points that we were talking about earlier? Which features are going to address those pain points? What's the most valuable, so that you can start there, right? And have a quick turnaround with that agile process you're talking about. So without having to wait to the end of the project, your stakeholders can get it in their hands. They can try it out and say, this is exactly what we were looking for, or actually, we needed it to do this. And there's stuff like that if you don't find out until the end, it causes huge expensive changes that could have just been simple, integrated steps as part of the project. So yeah, that absolutely makes sense. So you would say your number one tip when choosing an agency is make sure they're using agile.
I think that is one of the most important aspects to having your application go well. Mm-hmm. Like I don't see very many applications go well that use waterfall. And if you want an example, go to almost any government website and tell me how your experience is on it.
Yeah.
And I guarantee that they pay 3 times to 5 times more than they should have if they would have done agile, because of all the changes that were needed. And then, how does it feel in your hands? It's clunky. Does it meet the requirements that the government set for it? Yeah, it meets all the requirements, but the requirement that the search bar should be in the top corner, it leads some interpretation, like what corner, the right or left corner, or is it the corner of the inner window that we're looking at? And then what ends up happening is somebody no matter how well you write it out, somebody has to make these interpretations. And when they're wrong, when it's in the wrong corner, then it confuses the users and it feels clunky.
Right.
And that's just an example, but there's tons of examples. Like you can look up all the mockups in the world, but the mockups don't tell you how the app is going to load. Like, is it going to be really slow? And if you do a flat rate project and they don't specify how fast the app loads in the requirements, or they say it needs to load in under 2 seconds, and then you realize, well, actually 2 seconds is a lot more time than I was thinking.
Yeah.
Well, now you got to increase your budget and do a whole lot of rework to make it more performant. When that should have all been done, 2 weeks, 3 weeks after when you ideally would have got the software in your hands for the first time.
It's such a seemingly obvious point to make. And for some reason, it seems a little bit controversial because there's so many people who really like waterfall as a project methodology. That's why it's a thing, right? There's a lot of people who follow waterfall project methodologies for all sorts of stuff, not just software. But just like you said, it's really, the way to think about it is waterfall is a fixed price project, right? And you can see the results of that in those government, whether it's a website or whatever. They're usually doing like, they want to find a lower bid. They want a fixed price. They know exactly how much they're paying their contractor to do this job. And on paper, that sounds good, right? Because you know exactly what you're spending, you know exactly what you're getting. But agile, on the other hand, is a time and materials model. Waterfall, fixed price, agile, time and materials. And that means that you don't end up overpaying because the developers have to overcharge you to make sure that they can give you a fixed price. You're paying for just exactly what happens. So as the name agile implies, it's flexible, right? If you plan a sprint with more hours, then your bill that month is going to be higher, and you plan a sprint with fewer hours, it's going to be lower. And it's ultimately just going to be exactly what was needed. However much time and materials, right there in the name, however much time and materials were needed to put that together for you.
Yeah, and just to clarify, a lot of agencies that do agile use a time and material based building system, but that's not always the case. Some will, maybe they'll charge a flat rate for every sprint that goes out the door. Like every group of features, they'll charge like a fixed rate, and that's still agile and it's still great. But a flat rate project is just going to be a nightmare, and a lot of times we choose to go that direction because that's kind of how the world's built around us. You buy a television, you know exactly how much it's going to cost. You buy a tractor or some machinery, you know exactly how much it's going to cost. When you build a house, you get your blueprints, you design it, and then you build it, and then it's done. And so we're so used to that style that when we move over to a different style that's more adequate for engineering, which is what software development is, it can confuse us and scare us, even though it is miles, like it's just so much better for the problem that we're trying to solve. And it's, people generally understand that really well. If I was to say, all right, your job, David, is to write a novel, but I get to decide everything about the novel, and I also get to decide when that novel's done. Like, I choose when I like it, and that's when it's done. And then I want you to give me a flat rate price on it. And then you say, well, okay, we can do that. How many pages is it going to be? And I say, like maybe 500 to 1,000 pages. And then like, at what point can you give me a flat rate, like, and have that flat rate fair for either you or I? It's not possible. It just isn't. Because the whole idea of having me be the deciding factor of when it's done, which is what happens in the flat rate projects, the business owner or the other person, like, I either decide when it's done and you're unsatisfied, or you decide when it's done and I'm unsatisfied. Like, it just isn't possible. And I think that using a novel is a pretty good symbolic representation of the problem that people find themselves in when they get themselves into these flat rate projects.
So moving beyond the project methodology, one thing I'm curious about is just like, how important is it for that agency, that development agency, to already have experience in your industry? So, for example, if I'm a food manufacturer and I've got a production line creating lasagna, is it okay if I hire a software agency that's only worked with, law firms and, maybe manufacturing companies or something like that? Do I need somebody in food and beverage, or how should people approach that? How important is industry specific knowledge?
I think it is important, but it's not critical, because if you're working with a really good agency, they should be able to understand the needs of your business, regardless of whether they've worked in your specific industry before. And it does help because there's often a lot of compliance, like regulatory things that you have that certain industries have, and there's also like specific industry terminology and lingo, and there's specific pain points. But we have to remember that software in and of itself, regardless of what it is built to solve problems. And if the person you're talking to can very clearly understand what the problems are, it shouldn't matter what industry, what industry you're in, or whether or not they've worked in that industry. But if you do find somebody who has a lot of experience specifically in your industry, I would, put maybe a star around their name when you're doing your evaluation, because it can be helpful. It'll reduce time that you spend explaining like industry specific things to them, right?
Yeah, so it's more important probably for industries that have those specific regulatory requirements you're talking about. Like if you're a hospital and you need a web app, probably choose an agency that has built healthcare software before, because they're going to understand HIPAA. They're going to understand, whatever the different requirements are for how that app needs to work. Is that what you're saying?
It mostly depends on the specifics of the software being built, right? Mm-hmm. Because you might say, oh, well, we're a healthcare organization, so we need to find somebody who does HIPAA, but maybe your app doesn't have anything to do with healthcare records, mm-hmm. right? Maybe your app is for nurses to be able to clock in and clock out for their shifts. Like, do you have to be an expert in healthcare to understand the clock out, clock in system? Absolutely not. You don't need to be an expert in healthcare to do healthcare based reports that have no, and so you got to think of like what's actually being delivered here, and find people who understand those objectives. That's more important than being able to understand the specifics of your industry. Now, if the app you're building is incredibly industry specific, where it'll take you days and days and days to explain to them how your industry works, then it becomes even more important to find somebody. Or you're right, if your app has a lot of compliance around it, then even more reason to go with somebody who has already experience that, right?
And then, beyond that, like you're saying, a lot of the time it's the same kind of basic functions, no matter what you're building or for whom, right?
Yeah, I'd say like the majority of our applications and most applications on the web have a form to create a record, a place to look at the record, a place to edit the record, and a place to delete the record. Mm-hmm. Like, it doesn't really matter what industry we're doing that for, as long as we understand the business outcomes, we can generally make that happen.
Are there any other factors that impact, how you choose an agency? Should people think about maybe the company culture at the agency that they're going with, and how that aligns with their own? Does that matter at all?
Yeah, there's a few other things that I would say matter. So we talked about methodology. The second thing we started to talk about was the business understanding. Like, how well does the agency understand your business needs? And I would say after methodology, the understanding of their needs is tied with who's going to be working on it, or whether your app's going to be a success or not. Because if the people you're talking to don't really understand your business goals, they can't see it from the same perspective as you do, then it's going to be very difficult for your application to be successful. The way to know is to evaluate their conversation skills and ask questions and see if they're making suggestions that make sense in the scope of your business. And if they can get to the point where they're presenting you with ideas of how software is able to solve your business goals that would have never occurred to you but are great ideas, then that's how you know that they truly understand your business. Because they're able to leap the gap from your business objectives, your pain points, to the specifics of how software fixes those. And that's a gap that you're not, like most people are really struggle with. And that's why we, have a team where we separate specialties, which is, the next part of the team. Looking at the team, do we have a variety of specialties? Because we have, the business analyst, and their literal job is to take the requirements from you, understand your business, and design how the software will be built around them. That's not something that our engineers do, because our engineers have a different set of specialties. They take the software requirements, and their job is to understand how to execute, what the best way is to build, and actually do the development. And then you have somebody else who's a specialist in making sure that app stays running. When there's spikes in traffic, we need to adjust to those by giving the application more resources. And so you have these different specialties. So I would look at the team and say, like, is the team made up of several different specialties? Do they have a business analyst on the team, or am I going to be speaking directly with a developer? Because, I'm a mediocre business analyst myself, but I'm a great developer. And, I have people on my team who do so much better than I do at speaking with the clients and understanding their needs. And so, I would look at both of those things. With the team, I think team culture is important. How are you going to be communicating with the agency that you hire? Are you going to be needing to talk to multiple people, or is it just going to be one person on the team that will be your point of contact? What's the company culture? What are the communication channels? Like, do you have instant message with them? What's the cadence of your meetings? I would make sure that there's a good cultural fit with you, with your organization. And I think that, methodology, the business understanding, the team, and then, as we talked about before, like, what is their experience with similar projects, similar functionalities, things like that.
So you mentioned a couple of things in there while you were talking about, evaluating the agency and looking at their company culture. I wanted to dig into their technical expertise. You mentioned a couple of things about, their capabilities and things like that. So how can people evaluate an agency's technical expertise? What sort of questions or indicators are there that, like we said earlier, everybody's going to say they're the number one pizza joint in New York. How can you really tell? How can you evaluate that?
Yeah, it's challenging, isn't it? It's a lot like knowing how great of a mechanic you have when you don't know much about cars. Some strategies that I would say are pretty much universal are to ask them about what technologies that they would recommend for an application like the one that they're going to build you, and what technologies they use for most of the applications. And I would do a Google search of that and see how old it is. Because we know, if we know one thing for sure, is the technologies that are coming out in the last couple of years are a lot better than the ones that came out 15 years ago. And unfortunately, there are way, way too many agencies that are still using 15, 20-year-old technologies. I highly recommend selecting an agency that's using modern technology solutions, because, every time these technologies get more modern, what they're doing is they're baking more into that technology that used to have to be done by hand. Things are getting more efficient, and the developers have less work over time. And, less work for you means you save money. And it also means that your app a lot of times works better. If it's baked into the technology and that technology is being used by millions and millions of people, then it's usually going to be a little bit better than doing it by hand with one or two developers.
Yeah, and that's, I think, another thing that makes perfect sense when you think about it, but for somebody new to software, it might be counterintuitive. The idea that using the brand new technology is the cheapest way to develop. A lot of people are thinking, oh, well, it's this, maybe it's cheaper if I go with this developer who isn't as advanced or as modern, but really no, right? Because like you said, what the modernization is that it doesn't take as long anymore. It's less work and you end up with a higher quality result. You've got better security baked into things, better, just general architecture and frameworks for building out the application. So not only is it a better result for your application, it's actually going to cost you less to go with modern technologies.
Like an actual example is page routers, which is when you switch pages in the app, what shows up for the user. Like if you go /home, the home page shows up. If you go /jobs, the job page shows up, right? Back in the day, we had to write that logic by hand. How that would work, how the authentication would work around that. That's stuff's baked into almost all the frameworks nowadays.
Yeah.
And so just the routing in itself, how many hours of work is gone because that's baked in. What about the security vulnerabilities around authentication? Like if you have your guy rolling his own authentication, like the chance of you having a data breach or something like that go up a lot. And also the guy's got to do all that work. So I wouldn't suggest anybody use like the build an app with beta, like the technology that just got off the press yesterday. But look for the big players in the space. Next.js is a good one. Laravel maybe. Like look at some of these bigger ones. And when I say technologies, I would say ask what framework they're going to use, ask what database they're going to use. I think those are some of the biggest ones. What programming languages maybe. The other thing is we've talked about the development process, make sure they're using agile, and then ask about their team structure. What we're looking for here is we're looking for a lot of diverse specialties. We're not looking for one guy who he does it all. We don't want that. We want a person that gets the requirements. We want people who have their specialties in the actual development process. We want QA of some sort that can be a specialty, or sometimes it's not. We want DevOps, which is a specialty in supporting, maintaining, and making sure that your application stays up, and delivering the application, deploying it. We want to see separations of these roles is what we want. And then we can also ask them like what technical decisions they've made for other projects and have them explain it. And if you don't understand it, it means that they probably don't understand it. And if anybody says, oh, that's because that's what we were most comfortable with to justify a 15-year-old framework, I would say run.
Yeah. Find a better developer for sure. So what about references? I think case studies and references are pretty valuable when picking any business to do business with. What should people be looking for when it comes to software agencies?
Yeah, I would definitely look at the case studies that they have. We're trying to find an alignment between projects that they've done in the past and the project they're going to do for you. I always think it's a good idea to check a couple references. I would check a newer client and a client that's been with the organization for longer than a year. For most web development agencies, apps get built. They're built for years. So I think I'd say a pretty good red flag is say, I'd like to speak with a client that's been with you, or two clients that have been with you for over 1 or 2 years, and they should be able to do that. In fact, we do software development, and I'd say 80% of our clientele has been with us for over a year. I'd say 75 have been with us for over 2 years. I would get on the phone with their clients, and I would ask them, you know, would you hire the agency again if you had to start over today? What do you like about them? What do you not like about them? How do they fit into your company culture? Ask if there's ever been any conflict and what the resolution was. You know, if you've been with somebody for years and years and years, you're probably going to have a couple hiccups in the road. And so ask them about that. It's important that you know getting into this from the beginning, like how did they resolve the issue? Because there's going to be some most likely. And so what's more important is how they fix it. And then you probably the other thing when it comes to, you know, checklist, and we're probably going to put together a like more comprehensive checklist for doing this evaluation. But how many years have they been in business is a good question to ask, because if they're brand new, there's a higher risk of them going out of business.
Yeah, I used to work in the solar industry, and that was a big thing, is that, you know, people could find a great deal on getting solar panels, and they're like, sweet, you know, that's the one I need because it's so much cheaper than everybody else, and they include this maintenance plan. It's going to be amazing. It's guaranteed for the next 20 years. And then that company goes out of business. And that's so common, right? Especially in the solar industry, but that happens a lot in a lot of industries. So yeah, that's a really good point. You want to pick somebody who you can see that their company has some longevity to it. You can see that they've got a sustainable business model, and that you're not going to be left high and dry, either, you know, partway through your project even, or a couple years down the line when you still need that app to keep running and you still need somebody to be updating security certificates or doing your maintenance. Yeah, you want to know that they're still going to be around.
No one can predict the future perfectly. You know, just because they've been in business for 10 years doesn't mean that they're not going to go out of business next year.
Right.
So, you know, make sure that in the agreement and ask them this up front, like, who owns the code? Is it me or is it you? Make sure that you own the code. Make sure that everything, if needed, could be transferred to a different agency or a different group of developers. And, you know, this kind of goes back to why it's important to pick more modern solutions, is because the more modern solutions, there's more people that, you know, that there's often more people that know how to use them and how to use them well. And so it reduces your risk a little bit. What you really want to avoid is an agency that's like, yeah, you know what we're going to do for you? We're going to build you a proprietary framework for your application. That's the worst case scenario, because even after you get the code, no one's going to want to touch it.
Yeah, it's so funny to even think of doing that, but people do. That's a real world pain point.
It wouldn't be in my head if it didn't happen.
Right. Yeah.
If I wouldn't have seen somebody come to me with that,
Yeah.
it wouldn't even be something I think about. But it happens way too often. It's very sad.
Yeah, more than people think. And really, I mean, the only good reason I can think of to do that in the first place is, I mean, it's not a good reason, but it's whoever decided to create that custom framework, their own new, you know, language or framework for this app, is that they just want to make themselves irreplaceable, right? They want to lock you into relying on them and their knowledge of how your app works. And that's not a healthy relationship to be in, whether it's your own employee or an agency you hired or what. So yeah, that makes sense. Well, thanks so much, Kelson. I feel like this was really valuable. I think we've answered the questions that people have when it comes to this. And let us know, guys, down below in the comments if you have more questions about this, or if you have questions on other topics related to technology and business strategy. We'll be happy to address them and engage in that discussion with you guys. But Kelson, was there anything else that you want to drive home here for our listeners when it comes to evaluating agencies for software projects?
Take your time, and one thing that you can't really add into like a checklist or a conversation is like your gut instinct. You know, once you evaluate a bunch of people, what the final decision will hang on is your instinct. So trust them.
Thanks so much, everybody. And if you want to find out more about what we do, or if you need any help implementing software in your business, please reach out. You can find us at ksensetech.com. And we offer free consultations. So you can book a meeting with an expert to talk about your project, your needs, and you can apply this framework to us and see how well we stack up to the competition. So awesome. Thanks, Kelson.
Yeah, thanks.